is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The Red Cross says it's begun registering hundreds of Ukrainian fighters as prisoners of war in Russian-held areas.
Our other headlines: the leaders of Finland and Sweden are welcome to the White House after both countries apply to join NATO.
Russia lays down terms for lifting its blockade on Black Sea ports as the United Nations warns of global food shortages.
In the red, global stock markets continue to dive on fears over inflation and the invasion of Ukraine.
And a nationwide baby formula shortage grips the United States. President Biden invokes a Cold War-era law to tackle the crisis. The International Committee of the Red Cross says it's begun registering hundreds of Ukrainian fighters as prisoners of war in Russian-held areas.
The detained soldiers surrendered from the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol after the long-running standoff came to an end this week. Russia says over 1,700 troops have surrendered from the steelworks so far. Well, let's talk to the Associated Press correspondent Kieran McQuillan in Lviv. Kieran, conflicting reports about the situation in Mariupol. What more do we know?
That's right, conflicting reports and conflicting numbers. And what little information that we're getting out, it's coming from the Russian Ministry of Defense as well as the International Committee for the Red Cross. Now, Russia claims that a total of 1,730 Azovstal fighters have now made it to the Donetsk region, or perhaps even to Russia. We're not entirely sure about that. Now, there were some figures that Russia put out a few weeks ago saying that there were 2,000 Azovstal fighters holed up in this plant. Does this mean that there's still 250 or so of them left? We just don't know that, and it's very difficult to know how Russia was able to calculate this figure, given that so many of these Azovstal fighters were fighting underground and could not be seen from the air. Now, this number that they have mentioned also includes 771 who surrendered in the last 24 hours. 80 of those were wounded. And another number that we know from Monday is 53. This is the number of critically ill Azovstal fighters who needed urgent medical treatment. That was initially how this prisoner exchange, as it's been presented by the Ukrainian side, got underway. We heard that over the weekend, and it was all about getting those critically ill fighters to some medical treatment somewhere. As for the rest, Ukraine is being tight-lipped about the exact numbers. They say it's due to the sensitivities around the ongoing negotiations on this process.
And what are the chances of getting international observers in to ensure that the Geneva Convention is being followed?
Well, physically, it's going to be quite difficult because no one can come in from the Ukrainian side. They would have to be negotiated through some sort of humanitarian corridor to open up. It would be more likely that they would come in from the Russian side, and that would mean the clearance of Moscow for that. Now, the Red Cross, for its part, has remained fairly tight-lipped about this in the process of registration that was going on. They actually started this on Tuesday. They only put out that statement this morning. And they say that under the 1949 Geneva Convention mandate, that they be given access to all prisoners of war in all places that they are being held. So whether or not they are getting access on the ground remains to be seen. They did open an office in Rostov-on-Don in Russia a few months ago. That provoked a little bit of criticism here in Ukraine, but it is proving that it's possible that this office is now being used to help facilitate the Red Cross's work under the convention. And look, being a prisoner of war, you know, it doesn't stop you from being convicted of war crimes. Look at what's happening in Kyiv and in Poltava today, where 3 Russians are being tried for that very crime.
Mariupol now under the control of Moscow. What does that mean for the Russian campaign in Ukraine?
Well, this was the one territorial gain that Russia really did want to make, this capture of Mariupol. In 2014, when Russian-backed separatists started their campaign of taking over a land grab of the Donetsk region and Crimea, Mariupol held out. So it's always been in Moscow's sights to get that city unblocked, as they say, so that there would be this land corridor between Russia and Donetsk, the region which is under Russian control, and the Crimea Peninsula. Now, despite all of Russia's military blunders, it looks indeed like it and its proxies have now been able to capture Mariupol. And those Russian prisoners which were pinned down in the siege of the city and trying to overcome those fighters in Avastol, they can now be freed up to go round and fight on this new front that's opening up, where the Ukrainians are also concentrating their firepower further to the north around the city of Severodonetsk.
Kieran, thanks for that. Kieran McQuillan from the Associated Press in Lviv.
Marco Sassoli is Professor of International Law at the University of Geneva. I asked him what rights and protections come with being a prisoner of war.
Correct to register them, but they are prisoners of war, not only if they are registered, but also when they are not registered. As soon as they fall into the power of the Russian Federation, and then they must be treated in accordance with the Third Geneva Convention, which gives them all kinds of rights, but gives also the International Committee of the Red Cross the right to visit them, to register them. They may write to their families. They must be treated humanely. They must be fed. The wounded and sick must be cared for. And they may be interned until the end of active hostilities, except if the two parties agree on an exchange.
Looking at recent history in similar situations, have countries adhered to the rules, and what penalties can be exacted for those who breach them?
Well, for instance, in the war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, also the regime of Saddam Hussein was one of the most inhumane regimes one could imagine. They nevertheless treated more or less correctly, according to the Third Geneva Convention, the Iranian prisoners of war. So I think the respect of prisoners of war is something which is profoundly anchored in the tradition of peoples. And the Soviet prisoners of war in the Second World War were precisely not treated in this way by Nazi Germany, and therefore Russia has a certain historical claim that prisoners of war must be treated correctly. As for the sanctions, if they are not treated correctly, well, if you find the individuals who ill-treat prisoners of war, they may and must be punished as war criminals. And for the rest, this is the general issue of how to enforce international law. But I think in this war between Russia and Ukraine, we have seen that the states, in particular Western European and North American states, took it very seriously when there were alleged violations by the Russian Federation.
And I want to ask you about this war crimes trial that's taking place in Kyiv. The Russian soldier involved has pleaded guilty, so what kind of sentence might he get? And is there any possibility of appealing against that?
Yes, there must be a possibility of appeal. The sentence depends on the Ukrainian criminal code. It is totally lawful to try a prisoner of war not for having participated in the hostilities or having been complicit to the Russian aggression, but for war crimes. And then because of a reservation the Russian Federation has made when it became party to the Third Geneva Convention, such a prisoner of war would lose prisoner of war status, and Ukraine, when fighting against Russia, may invoke the same reservation, but I hope they will not invoke it, but continue to treat them as prisoners of war. Anyway, they have to be treated humanely.
President Joe Biden is hosting the leaders of Finland and Sweden at the White House. The Finnish president and Swedish prime minister are discussing their countries' applications to join NATO. Both requested to join the military alliance after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett, watching events for us in New York. John, Sweden and Finland had already requested to join NATO. So what did President Biden hope to achieve in these talks?
Yeah, it's all pretty amazing, really, Jamie and Robin, because the request only went in jointly earlier this week, and now the two leaders, Sweden and Finland, standing in the White House with the president, and that is something that would have been thought unthinkable in Pentagon circles in Washington, D.C. only a handful of weeks ago. It really is quite extraordinary. These two countries, of course, are committed to their neutrality, or they have been. They do have militaries, but they're mainly for domestic purposes, though they have gone outside of their countries to help in various humanitarian-type operations around the world. But now they're committing to NATO, and all that means, in other words, if a NATO member is attacked, then they will have to go to war as well to defend that NATO member. And the fact that the meeting was hurriedly arranged on a day when the president is flying to Asia is the clearest possible signal that the White House could send to NATO members that it wants Sweden and Finland in the NATO family. President Biden at the event a few hours ago saying that he knows that it is an irritant to Russian President Vladimir Putin, but that Sweden and Finland joining NATO is not a threat to Russia or any other country. Take a listen.
Today I'm proud to welcome and offer the strong support of the United States for the applications of two great democracies and two close, highly capable partners to join the strongest, most powerful defensive alliance in the history of the world. Two proud, independent countries exercising the sovereign rights all states possess to decide their own security.
Now, it is not all smooth sailing for Sweden and Finland, even though they've been welcomed effectively into NATO today by President Biden at the White House. Turkey is a standout. They're not keen on the two countries joining for various reasons. Jake Sullivan, who's the White House security advisor here, the national security advisor, thinks that they can overcome those issues with President Erdogan. And for his part, President Biden, before he goes to Asia, will be urging the Congress to pass another $40 billion to go to Ukraine, which is presently stalled on Capitol Hill. And just quickly, as for that Asia trip, he's going to the Republic of Korea and also to Japan, two key U.S. allies, at a time when there are problems arising regarding North Korea, both for its nuclear proliferation ambitions and also COVID-19. Guys?
John, we're just watching the live pictures of Joe Biden's plane about to depart for his trip to Asia, which you just mentioned. We'll stay on those pictures, but let me ask you about events back in New York, because the United Nations is talking about international food security.
Yes, well, do stay on those pictures, because it is always a remarkable event when Air Force One takes off. I don't think it's something that ever really gets old, and the cameras follow it as long as they can until the plane goes into the clouds. Yeah, there are two events regarding food security that you should be aware of at the United Nations. The first one I'm going to talk about happened yesterday, Wednesday, and there's another one going on now in the Security Council here in New York. But basically, the UN is very, very worried about food security. They say the issue has doubled in the last 2 years, from 135 million people to 276 million. The people who are seriously food insecure, which means they could die because they're not getting enough food or lose their jobs, has gone from 108 million to 161 million. And the UN says that half of those I'm talking about here are exposed now to famine conditions, and that's up 500% since 2016. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said within the last 24 hours that the world must act together urgently and with solidarity. And the meeting of ministers that took place on Wednesday was chaired by Antony Blinken, who's chairing the meeting of the Security Council now as well on the same subject. And he said that this is the greatest global food security crisis of our time, and he blamed the pandemic and also climate change for it.
John,
Jamie,
thanks
Robert.
for that. John Terrett in New York, and we've been watching live pictures of Air Force One carrying President Joe Biden leaving for his first summit in Asia as president.
Well, while President Biden has been hosting leaders from Finland and Sweden in Washington, NATO has been meeting in Brussels. Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has formally accepted membership applications from Finland and Sweden to join NATO, and he's been giving a press conference. Well, let's talk to CGTN's correspondent Mark Webster, who's in Brussels. So, Mark, what did Jens Stoltenberg have to say?
Well, Mr. Stoltenberg gave a fairly downbeat assessment of how he sees the situation in Ukraine at the moment. He warned NATO that this could be a long war. He said, we are in this for the long haul. At the same time, he praised NATO members for their solidarity. He said NATO has never been more united. Now, as you say, he was in Denmark today, thanking the Danish Prime Minister for her country's support. And he went on to say this.
All of these matters as we face the most dangerous security situation in Europe for decades. The Euro-Atlantic family has responded to Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine with unprecedented unity. NATO fully supports Ukraine's right to self-defense enshrined in the UN Charter. That is why allies, including Denmark, are stepping up their support for Ukraine. Ukraine can win this war.
But, Mark, it's not a done deal that Finland and Sweden will now join NATO, is it?
Well, it isn't. There is still a lot of hard work to be done. But Mr. Stoltenberg was asked this question specifically during his trip to Denmark, and he was quite dismissive. He said, you know, we're confident that we can move swiftly to conclude an agreement. He said within NATO we're used to having disagreements, but we always manage to solve them among friends. So what is necessary, he said, is obviously talks on this subject. The fact that President Biden has given such a public support to the idea of these two countries joining will certainly add to the momentum. But Mr. Erdogan knows very well indeed that he has a great deal of leverage here. You know, he is deeply unhappy with the fact that he says that both of the countries have given support and maybe given shelter to people he considers terrorists, particularly the PKK, the Kurdish group. And it'll take a lot of persuading, I think, to get him on board. But at the same time, what NATO will be saying is it's so important for our collective security. It's so vital that we stick together and that we spread the burden as much as possible. Because don't forget, you know, Finland has an 800-mile border with Russia. And he'll say, unless we get these countries inside Article 6, that's the article which says one country is attacked, all countries are attacked, then our collective security will be in danger. And that is what they're going to be saying to him. But I'm sure President Erdogan will be trying to get the absolute maximum in return from Washington and from the other countries in NATO.
Mark Webster in Brussels, thanks very much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, carry on cooking. Indonesia scraps its palm oil export ban, bringing relief to global markets.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
The invasion of Ukraine and rising commodity prices are all taking their toll on the markets. European stock exchanges have continued to fall and taken a bit of a beating. It comes after United States shares recorded their worst daily fall since the start of the pandemic. Craig Earlham is Senior Market Analyst at Oanda. Craig, let's look at the losses first of all, which are pretty sobering. Which areas have been hit hardest, or is this simply across the board?
Well, it is widespread, and we look at yesterday, the Nasdaq was the hardest hit, so that's primarily your tech stocks. So we can see that has been hammered quite considerably. That's been the case really for a number of weeks now, as higher interest rate expectations have been priced into the markets. But consumer stocks as well have taken quite a big hit. I think a lot of the latest plunge seems to come on the back of the Walmart and Target's numbers, which suggest that their costs are rising quite rapidly, their margins are being squeezed, and ultimately that is going to be passed on to the consumer. We're already seeing prices rising across the board, and it seems like the squeeze on consumers, not just here in the UK, but in the US and elsewhere, is going to continue to happen in the coming months, because ultimately many of these retailers need to protect their margins and protect their own profits.
This is a horrible question, I know, but get your crystal ball out. How much of this can be put down to a short-term blip, or do you think we're seeing a wider trend develop here?
I think ultimately we're heading for a significant slowdown in the economy. It feels inevitable and inescapable. We're already seeing extremely high levels of inflation in the US. It's peaked at around 8.5% here in the UK. It's going to go to double figures later on in the year when we see the energy price cap rising. That's extremely difficult for households and businesses to sustain for any period of time, not least at a time when interest rates are also compounding that pressure as they continue to rise well into next year. So I feel like it's inevitable that we are going to see an economic slowdown, probably a recession in many countries at this point. And I think a lot of the numbers which we're seeing now and we're starting to see materialise are going to contribute towards that. The question just becomes, how fast is it going to hit, and how much will the impact on the economy potentially alleviate some of the work that the central banks need to do. But right now, I think what we're seeing in the markets is something we should really continue get used to, because we've seen a big declines over the course of the last month or two, and I think there's probably a little bit further to go yet.
All countries are worried about the cost of living crisis and debating policies to mitigate that. I wonder, how could the markets respond?
Well, it's extremely difficult because each country is kind of responding to this in a different way. You look at the US, for example, and the consumer is still in a quite healthy position. There was a number of different schemes over the course of the last 2 years, which means that aggregate savings have been rising over that period of time. So we're still seeing retail sales, for example, more broadly remain quite positive, even though prices are rising, but that can only last so long. Here in the UK, there's a big push to support lower-income households because they're the ones who are going to suffer the most now over the course of the next 6, 12, 18 months. But again, we're seeing pushback from the Treasury with regards to that, and the question becomes, how much pressure can they sustain before they do throw out some of this support? And if they don't, then the economy is going to suffer as well. And in Europe, we're seeing subsidies being paid, for example, on energy bills, etc., which is trying to alleviate some of those pressures. All of these are short-term solutions, but it doesn't solve the broader inflation issue that is hampering these economies all around the world, and that is forcing central banks to do something they just simply don't want to do. And it almost feels like we've hit a point now where the only way that this can be solved is going to be with interest rates leading to a recession, demand destruction, and then a return, a gradual return to economic health. And at this point in time, like I say, there is a feeling of inevitability. The hope is that the central banks, like the Fed is trying to push for, can achieve the soft landing, which means slower economic growth, slower economies, but avoid a recession and avoid the job losses that come with that.
Craig, good to see you. Thanks for that. Craig Earlham, Senior Market Analyst at Oanda.
Half of all Gazprom's clients have set up payment accounts in rubles, according to Russia's Deputy Prime Minister. Alexander Novak says 54 companies have met the Kremlin's demands that energy contracts with Russian suppliers be paid using the national currency. However, the European Union is warning that ruble payments to energy giant Gazprom may be in violation of sanctions.
Sri Lanka has defaulted on its debt for the first time as it struggles with its most devastating economic crisis in 70 years. The central bank confirmed the country has missed the deadline to make a $78 million interest repayment after an additional 30-day grace period expired.
A safety agency in the United States is investigating a crash involving a Tesla vehicle that killed 3 people. Tesla's autopilot system is being looked at as part of the probe. Tesla says its autopilot system requires driver supervision and does not make the vehicle autonomous.
Indonesia, the world's biggest shipper of cooking oils, has lifted its ban on palm oil exports. The move will bring relief to the global market as Ukraine's war chokes off critical supplies of sunflower oils. Indonesia's ban was aimed at ensuring supplies in the local market and reducing domestic prices.
So Indonesia's palm oil exports will resume on Monday after the ban, which lasted for 3 weeks. But Malaysia, the world's second biggest producer, is facing a foreign labour shortage, so it hasn't fully benefited from the temporary gap in the market. Ryan Meltzer reports.
Some 84% of workers on Malaysia's palm oil plantations are foreigners, a reality that has left the country unable to capitalise on high prices.
Ever since the pandemic, there were 0 workers coming for 2 years, but workers were leaving. So the situation is now very acute because we estimated, as of now, there are more than 100,000 workers we are short of. So that has resulted in us not being able to fully optimize our production numbers.
Malaysian production actually dropped last year, despite rebounding global demand. Prices of crude palm oil were high even before the conflict in Ukraine crimped the supply of competing oils and pushed palm oil prices to record levels. Labour shortages are estimated to have cost the local industry almost $5 billion in lost production last year.
We are pressuring the government. The government is fully aware of our problem, and I think they're trying the best to expedite it. So we hope within the next 2 months we will get the bulk of what we require, at least 50% of it.
Aside from pushing up palm oil prices, the Ukraine conflict is also tightening supply of fertilizers.
Fertilizer prices have gone up, so we may see some dampening impact of high fertilizer prices on productivity in the coming months.
The palm oil industry has greatly increased automation and mechanization, but still needs to do more, with the key job of harvesting palm oil still entirely manual.
This pandemic has put us on the wall. We got no choice but to do something about it. I would say it's a blessing in disguise. It's an eye-opener to us that we are so dependent, we are so reliant on guest workers.
Consumers feeling the bite of rising food prices will be relieved Indonesia is ending its export ban, and we'll have to hope Malaysia's labour shortages ease soon too. Ryan Meltzer, CGTN, Kuala Lumpur.
US President Biden has invoked an emergency law from the Cold War and asked the military to step in to address an acute shortage of baby formula. The Defence Production Act, giving the president power to control domestic industries, has been used to speed up production. The military will also oversee Operation Fly Formula to bring in supplies from overseas. Well, Dr. Stephen Abrams is Professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Dell Medical School at the University of Texas in Austin. Welcome to the programme, Dr. Abrams. So we're seeing a situation where some people in the United States can't access this formula milk that for many is the only thing that they use to feed their babies. How did we get to this point?
Well, a couple of things happened. There have been general supply challenges related to the pandemic that made formula supplies be lower than they usually were. And then one of the major factories in the United States had a shutdown and a recall in February of this year, and that kind of triggered this much worse situation.
So we've seen some extreme measures to try and combat this shortage. How serious is it?
Well, for some families, especially those using very specialized formulas, it's been a big problem. For most families, it just forced them to really look hard to find the formula they need or to switch off between different formulas.
We are hearing reports, though, of some people who can't get hold of formula milk trying to make their own. This isn't a good idea, is it?
It's a terrible idea. The homemade formulas cannot really assure sterility and safety, and the nutrient mixes are not adequate for babies. Babies need either breastfeeding or commercial formula.
So what should people do if they just can't get hold of the formula milk that they need?
Well, if the baby's close to a year of age for a very short period of time, if preferably just a couple of days, they could use whole cow milk. The other thing people have to do is reach out to their pediatrician, the food sources, and hunt around, and also try to get help from their friends, because we're waiting. I think hopefully soon the situation will start to get better, but for right now it's a real challenge for families.
And you mentioned these guidelines that have been brought in allowing older babies to switch to cow's milk earlier than they might have done. Is this the right move? Will this ease the pressure on supplies?
Well, we hope that if families who have babies are close to a year of age are able to give a little bit of extra formula that they might have for babies that are under 6 months of age, it'll help make sure that those smaller babies have something to eat. We want babies to maintain on formula until a year of age, but certainly for a short period of time, it's one way to try to make sure that we have formula supplies protected for younger infants.
Okay, Dr. Stephen Abrams from Dell Medical School, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Hungary's Viktor Orban issues a rallying cry to US conservatives meeting in Europe for the first time.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The Red Cross says it's begun registering hundreds of Ukrainian fighters as prisoners of war in Russian-held areas.
Our other headlines, US President Joe Biden has been hosting the leaders of Finland and Sweden at the White House after both countries applied to join NATO.
Russia's foreign ministry says any lifting of its naval blockade off Ukraine should be discussed alongside the lifting of sanctions against Moscow.
It all comes as the United Nations says it's working intensely to restore Ukrainian grain exports amid fears of an international food crisis. Our correspondent Julia Chapman reports.
Ukraine is a major exporter of grain and sunflower oil. Russia now has control over most of its Black Sea ports, preventing any movement. Solving this conundrum is causing a headache for the UN, which fears the ongoing blockade could accelerate the risk of widespread famine and food shortages across the world. Now, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko has said sanctions against Moscow are interfering with free trade. He insists that opening Ukrainian ports has to be considered alongside the West dropping their sanctions. Russia's ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov, says food security is undermined not by Russia, but by what he called the illiterate macroeconomic steps of the West. Meanwhile, the governor of Russia's Kursk region says Ukrainian shelling has killed one person and injured another at a distillery in a border village. Roman Starovoyt has shared photographs of damage to the plant and residential buildings in Tyotkina. This is the second confirmed civilian death in Russia attributed to Ukrainian shelling. Last week, an 18-year-old was killed in the Belgorod region. Ukraine has neither confirmed nor denied responsibility for cross-border attacks. Julia Chapman, CGTN, Moscow.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has called for diplomacy to solve the Ukrainian war. Wang said sending weapons to Ukraine would not achieve peace, and imposing sanctions on Russia will not solve Europe's security concerns. He said China opposes forcing countries to pick sides. Wang was talking to foreign ministers from Brazil, Russia, India and South Africa.
The finance ministers of the G7 nations are in Germany for talks, with aid for Ukraine top of the agenda. And we've just heard they've agreed in principle to $18 billion of funding for Ukraine. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin. So, Trent, what have discussions been focusing on with this new announcement following?
Yeah, well, we are just starting to hear some whispers coming out of that meeting. A draft communique, it seems, has been leaked to several outlets, including Reuters, and it basically sets out what the G7 finance ministers have agreed to help Ukraine with. So we knew going into this meeting today Ukraine was really going to dominate the agenda. There was certainly a fundraising effort going in of around $15 billion US, but it seems they've gone a bit higher than that. In fact, Christian Lindner, the German foreign minister who is hosting this meeting, of course, with Germany being in the rotating chair of the presidency, he said the priority is to restore the liquidity of the Ukrainian state. Now, this information that we are hearing really in the past hour or so suggests, and I'll just read here from the communique that's been released, draft communique, I should say. We have mobilised $18.4 billion US of budgetary support, including $9.2 billion US for recent commitments in the lead up to the Petersburg meeting. This is designed to help Ukraine close its financing gap and continue ensuring the delivery of basic services to the Ukrainian people. So I think that's a really important point, that last one, because we knew this money was not meant to be loans, it was meant to be grants to get into the hands of the Ukrainians really quickly, because of course the government revenues there have collapsed because of this war, and there is a real effect now starting to be felt, you know, with people's services, medical and the like. So it seems that there is money now heading in that direction. Of course, we're yet to get official confirmation, but if this is to be believed, then it seems that quite a substantial sum of money is on its way to Ukraine to try and help the government with a financial lifeline.
So this has emerged from the meeting of G7 finance ministers. There's another G7 meeting happening too.
Yeah, that's right. So the finance ministers are meeting in Bonn, the former capital of West Germany, whereas the health ministers are now in the current capital, where I am, here in Berlin. And of course, they are also discussing some issues around Ukraine. The health minister said it's not just weapons that need to be delivered there, but also medical care and hospitals. But it is, of course, the COVID-19, which is more centre of the agenda there. In fact, we heard from the health minister today of Germany, who again is hosting the meeting, saying this pandemic is not over yet, and we know that this one's not going to be the last. And this is where it gets quite interesting, because he says G7 ministers are calling for post-pandemic readiness, to strengthen the role of the WHO and to test how we will deal with future pandemics. And to do that, they are actually now running a simulation as we speak behind closed doors. It's a simulation focused on a scenario where a smallpox pandemic is triggered by a leopard bite. The idea is to see how those G7 governments would respond and to see whether they've learned any lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Trent, thanks very much. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin.
The invasion of Ukraine has been adding to the woes of global supply chains already disrupted during the COVID pandemic.
Car manufacturing has been hit not only in Ukraine and Russia, but also in Europe, where it slowed the supply of components. Our correspondent Natalie Carney reports.
First, it was global COVID-19 lockdowns that disrupted supply chains around the world. Then, a shortage of semiconductors limited manufacturing in many sectors. Now, the conflict in Ukraine is hitting a variety of products, such as wheat, sunflower oil, and even critically important electrical wiring made in the country. This is forcing governments to reassess growth expectations. Germany has slashed its GDP forecast from 4.6% to 1.8% this year, citing the war in Ukraine. Many European car manufacturers and auto parts companies have factories in Ukraine, most of which have been closed due to the fighting. At the same time, in response to sanctions, Russia has threatened to restrict trade in some raw materials widely used in automotive production, such as nickel, an essential ingredient in EV batteries. This disruption in available automotive components is having a big impact on manufacturers around the world.
In our estimation, the automotive industry will be the worst market in the world for the next 10 years. Europe is suffering very badly, but of course so is the USA and also China.
Hyundai and Toyota have suspended production at their St. Petersburg, Russia plants due to disruptions in supply chain issues, while automaker Renault said it would suspend manufacturing in Moscow. Production is also being limited across Europe. Here in Germany, both BMW and Volkswagen have shut some assembly lines for the lack of components that are made in Ukraine, while the French tire manufacturer Michelin has also announced it would be closing some plants across Europe because of supply chain issues created by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Yet even when the supply chain issues are resolved and production can resume, there will be concerns about whether demand will recover.
We assume that manufacturing will recover from the production side, but then we still have a problem with the demand.
It is predicted that global automakers will produce fewer than 82 million cars in 2022, a sharp decrease from the 94 million built in 2018. Natalie Carney, CGTN, Munich, Germany.
Liberal ideas are threatening Western civilization, the rather blunt message from Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban in his address to America's foremost conservative conference meeting in Budapest. The right-wing leader advised United States and the European groups to align their policies and reconquer institutions in both Brussels and Washington. Our correspondent Ross Cullen is in Budapest. Ross, what more did Orban have to say in this speech?
Yeah, Jamie, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, giving the keynote address here at CPAC, Hungary. He lamented the loss of Donald Trump losing to Joe Biden in the 2020 US presidential election. He said that Donald Trump was dragged down by the swamp in Washington in much the same way as Hungary was dragged down by the progressive and socialist swamp after the socialists won the 2002 general election. He said, Viktor Orban, that since 2010 he has been rescuing Hungary from the illnesses created to the state by the progressives, and he did say that for conservatives and ultra-right, for nationalists and populists, their opponents are progressive Marxists from the international liberal left wing. So absolutely no doubt about which side of the political debate Viktor Orban is aligning himself with, and no doubt as well if you look at the cast of characters who are also attending this debate, this two-day conference. You can see the conference hall behind me. Day one has wrapped up. Viktor Orban leading today, when he was also saying that God, the homeland, the family, these are the key tenets of the nationalist populist message that he is putting across after having secured a fourth consecutive term in office here in Budapest after winning the April the 3rd general election. So he is the host. Hungary is the overall host, and he has made no doubt that he has situated Hungary at the moment in the current political spectrum, situating Hungary in the middle of that ultra-right, conservative, nationalist and populist debate.
And what's the significance of this CPAC event taking place in Europe for the first time?
Well, Jamie, it was set up in the 1970s in the United States as a space for American conservative debate. Ronald Reagan actually gave the inaugural address before he went on to win the US presidency in the 1980s. Since then, it has taken on a bit more of a Trumpian kind of influence since the 2016 victory in the US presidential election by Donald Trump and that ultra-right populist message. Nigel Farage has been speaking. Eduardo Bolsonaro, who's one of the sons of the right-wing Brazilian president, has been speaking. Also, the leader of the far-right Austrian Freedom Party has been speaking. So we have seen this change in the overall message of CPAC. They have held events outside the United States before in South Korea and Japan. This is the first time the CPAC has been held in Europe, and they have come to Hungary, come to a safe space for conservative debate here. It is a lovely location, I do have to say, Jamie, on the banks of the River Danube, and we have seen people coming from across Europe to attend this conference. Tomorrow there could well be an address virtually by Donald Trump.
Ross, thank you for that. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Budapest.
One person has been injured in a shooting at a school in the German city of Bremerhaven. The suspected gunman has been arrested. Pupils and teachers used chairs and tables to barricade themselves into classrooms. A female staff member was injured and has been taken to hospital.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson will face no more police action over lockdown parties held at Downing Street during the pandemic. The police say they have concluded their investigations into so-called Partygate after issuing 126 fines to 83 people, including one for the Prime Minister. But an investigation into the parties is expected to be published next week.
The DPRK has increased its production of drugs and medical supplies as it battles an unprecedented coronavirus outbreak. This includes sterilizers, thermometers and traditional Korean medicines used to reduce fever and pain. The DPRK also sent 3 of its largest cargo planes to China to collect medical supplies. The country is under lockdown.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, fancy a free ride in a London taxi? It's all part of Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee celebrations.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just gotta be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
Is the front line now after 9 days of fighting?
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the
Within
front
clear
line.
view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
This week on Razor, Guy Henderson meets the scientists who are working to revive the underwater kelp forests along the UK's coastline and bring back its biodiversity.
This is a small experimental area, but if we can prove that the removal of trawler pressure itself results in a rewilding and regeneration and recovery of things like fisheries for local fisheries and so forth, then it's an argument for doing it everywhere.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Hong Kong has eased lockdown restrictions despite the emergence of some COVID clusters.
Many hospitality businesses like bars have reopened while restaurants can operate until midnight. Our correspondent Anne Cheng reports.
Hong Kong is on track to return to normal as social distancing measures have been further relaxed. They were put in place in January to combat a fifth coronavirus wave, but they've started easing in phases since last month. With this second phase, service hours at restaurants can extend till midnight and cruises can resume. Places like karaoke lounges, party rooms, nightclubs and bars can also reopen now.
I just finished my exams, so I can relax now. Today happens to be the day that karaoke places reopen, so I took the chance to come and sing. I also plan to dine out with more friends.
Actually, I don't have any plan, but today I feel very happy because I saw all the people, they're more relaxing, more happier. You can feel it.
For some others, plans were made to come here.
The resounding shuffle of mahjong tiles across tables can be heard again as mahjong parlors have been given the green light to reopen. This place reopened about an hour ago, and some eager players are already here. It's a testament to how much this popular pastime has been missed.
As for mask requirements, they won't be needed for people exercising in indoor sports premises and gyms so long as air change requirements are met. But vaccine passes are still needed to enter most premises in the city. Meanwhile, some measures that were meant to ease today were relaxed 2 weeks earlier, like the reopening of public pools and beaches. Officials say they sped up the timetable because the pandemic trend appeared stable. These easings come as several COVID clusters have emerged in the city, sparking concern of a sixth wave. One expert, however, isn't worried.
Yes, I think overall it's appropriate to ease infection control measures further, given that in Hong Kong we have more than half the population, 4 million people infected with COVID already. So overall the natural immunity is very high. And the rest, those not infected, already have at least 2 doses of vaccination. So overall, the protection is very, very good. And also it's important to just look at the number of severe cases and mortality rather than looking at the actual number of infections. Currently, we have very, very few patients with severe disease or mortality.
The third and final round of easing is slated for late June, though Chief Executive Carrie Lam says there won't be much left to ease. Lam also says, if feasible, she's inclined to relax measures even further so that on July 1st, the 25th anniversary will be celebrated in a more relaxed environment. Anne Cheng, CGTN, Hong Kong.
Coronavirus control measures have disrupted plans for tourists across large parts of the world, but it's also given rise to a form of travel known as cloud tourism in China, where you can go exploring from the comfort of your own armchair. Our correspondent Cao Chufeng reports.
The Canton Tower, the third tallest tower in the world, and a landmark destination in Guangzhou. Since opening in 2010, it's welcomed visitors not only from China, but from around the world. Now, even as COVID-19 has squashed travel, there's still ways to get a taste of this site, long distance.
I'm standing on top of the Canton Tower. If you look over there, you can get a breathtaking view of all of Guangzhou. But you don't really have to come here to enjoy the view. Just take out your phone and go into the live streaming room. And here you go. It's just like standing on top of the city. A so-called slow live streaming that lasts for around half a day every day to showcase the view of Guangzhou. It's just one type of cloud tourism that Canton Tower offers. From a VR online tour to short online videos, the tourist destination hopes the internet can help promote its brand, especially during the pandemic.
During the pandemic, we need to be even more creative because we can't promote our brand to many customers face-to-face. Therefore, we need to introduce our products in Guangzhou City through cloud tourism. And after the pandemic, tourists should have already developed a deep understanding of our scenic spot. I believe this will lead to a large number of tourists coming to Canton Tower.
And Canton Tower is hardly alone in its appeal for cloud tourism. Shanghai-based Ctrip is an online travel agency as well as a tourism-related live streaming platform. For the first 4 months of this year, viewing volume for live streams organized by Ctrip itself increased by 156% compared to the same period last year. And for live streams broadcast by third parties on the platform, users' viewing volume increased by 91%.
At present, many people may be going through home quarantine, so they have the strong desire to go out. Watching travel live streams can relax their mood and relieve their anxiety and pressures from staying at home. For example, watching a tour guide live streaming can give them an immersive experience.
Li Dong says big, well-known tourist destinations like Disney remain the most popular for cloud tourists, while lesser-known scenic spots are hoping more creative content and interactive experiences will get them to stand out from the crowd. Cao Chufeng, CGTN, Guangzhou.
Now, how about a free taxi ride in London? Well, some London taxi drivers are offering a surprise treat to visitors as Britain's Queen Elizabeth celebrates 70 years on the throne. Look out for electric cabs if you're planning a trip. CGTN's Guy Henderson reports.
London's cabbies are already warming up for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. These increasingly prevalent electric black cabs are being decked out with regalia, and drivers have a little surprise in store for those hopping in.
We're coming up to the Jubilee. We're also celebrating 7,000 sales of the London LEVC TXE, the electric cab. If you're lucky enough to see one of these free taxis, you might be surprised we're giving away free rides for the next week.
As the capital gears up for a serious party, these vehicles will take passengers anywhere across the city. Demand for rides plummeted during lockdowns, but not anymore.
We've not been out and about as much this past couple of years, but finally, summer's in the air, the tourists are back, celebrations are on the way, and now a handful of London cabbies is offering free rides. Just look out for labelling like this.
Chinese auto giant Geely put the black cab back in business back in 2013, buying the failing company that owned them, and launching a drive to go fully electric. Nearly a decade on, there are more and more of them around.
There are approximately 14,000 black cabs running around in London at the moment, and of those, just over 5,000 of them today are LEVC TX with its electric drive. So that's a third, fundamentally, of the vehicles. And we expect, over time, those vehicles ultimately all to become electrified as the next few years evolve.
On the day itself, Queen Elizabeth II will be travelling in a 4-ton horse-drawn Gold State coach. For the rest of us, maybe even free of charge, try an electric Hackney carriage. Guy Henderson, CGTN, London.
The headlines again. The Red Cross says it's begun registering hundreds of Ukrainian fighters as prisoners of war in Russian-held areas.
Russia lays down terms for lifting its nations warns of global food shortages.
And a baby formula shortage grips the United States. President Biden invokes a Cold War-era law to tackle the crisis.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.